and welcome to Automating Azure HDInsight, also known as PowerShell meets Hadoop. My name is Brian Cafferkey, and I want to give you a quick highlights of what we're going to be doing here. It's going to be pretty quick. It's going to be one of my shorter videos, so that's good. And I will point out that I am drinking out of my Starfleet mug. I like to have a collection of mugs, different sort of logos. But I actually visited Starfleet Academy when I was visiting San Francisco a while ago. People don't realize, but it's cloaked, and you can visit Starfleet Academy if you know how to cross the Trans-Dimensional Gateway, which I happen to do because there's a Python interface. So it was great. I got in there and I was able to get a mug, see the whole place. It's not easy to get to, and I can't really tell you much about it due to NDA type requirements because there's a lot of futuristic stuff. You know, obviously they're 500 years in the future. But anyway, great trip, and I got a mug to show. Anyway, here we go. So what I want to talk about here is automation. So I call this PowerShell meets Hadoop because a lot of times I focus so much on PowerShell, and the question might come up, well, what does that got to do with big data and machine learning? Everything. It has to do with automation, and that's what everything's about in the end. And automation in this sense is like we're going to have to create things in Azure, in this case Hadoop clusters, to do work for us. And if we don't want to keep paying for those things, I jump all over this, people. You don't have to pay when you don't want to in the cloud, but you do have to automate things so that they get turned off and you don't have to pay. And that's what I want to show you today. I'll talk a little about what HDInsight is and the cluster types that you can create within that. And then I'll talk about the magic of automation. As always, there's a link on github.com with the slides and the code related to this. So please take a look at that and all the other content I have out there. So starting out, what is HDInsight? HDInsight in a nutshell is Hadoop Platform as a Service on Azure. And it's the Hortonworks distribution of Hadoop. So distributions, if you're not used to that in open source world, is just a way that people package things up. Some distributions like Python's Anaconda are free distributions. But in the case of Hadoop, Cloudera and Hortonworks are commercial companies that package Hadoop up, which the Hadoop itself is free and open source. But they give value added like help desk support and things like that, and some extra tools they add in, I believe, and throw into the mix so that you get some extra value out of that. So in Azure, you can create a cluster, and what happens is Microsoft Azure sort of adds some magic around it, so it will take care of a lot of the administrative details for you, which is what Platform as a Service does. So configuration is basically just a mouse clicks away. You can change things and make adjustments, and you don't have the sort of grueling overhead of trying to manage all that on like physical machines, or even more than just in the cloud where you have to still specify a lot. A lot of it's taken care of. MapReduce is really at the core of all the big data solutions. So the idea with MapReduce is that you, at the end of the day, it's basically scaling out to many machines to break up the work so it can get it done faster. We've hit the constraints of what a single machine can do, and now we've got data volumes that just aren't possible on a single machine, and that's where MapReduce comes in. Hadoop Platform as a Service, as I mentioned what that is, and I want to talk about several types of clusters you can create. And there's a link at the bottom of this slide, so if you get the slide, you can click that link, and that will give you details about how to provision your own HDInsight clusters. And I did this, I actually worked on this demo a couple of months ago, kind of came back to it recently, and I noticed my code broke because apparently there's changes in the interface. So I do want to give you a warning that, you know, in automation, there's always that change. Microsoft making things better. In this case, they no longer allowed uppercase characters in cluster usernames. So maybe it's got a Linux reason or something, but it had been allowing that in previously. So just be aware that you've got to kind of monitor these things. Sometimes APIs could change and things, and you might have to make slight adjustments. All right, so I will point out the Apache Hadoop ecosystem is very far and wide. Sometimes I use the analogy of like a kitchen drawer. Lots of things get thrown in there, and it's not like it was a single thought out system. It is a lot like the kitchen drawer. You know, some company develops something and they decide it's not commercially viable, like I guess Zeppelin Notebook's a good example, and so they decide we'll give it to the Apache Hadoop system, which is great, but it can lead to a kind of fragmented feel when you look at the Apache Hadoop ecosystem. And I have a whole different video I do on this, so please go look that up if you want to know more about what these different services are. But suffice to say, when you requisition or provision a Hadoop cluster using the HDInsight in Azure, you kind of pick some part of this that you want to work with. So that sort of middle thing there, the MapReduce, Hadoop Yarn, and HDFS, that's kind of the core Hadoop system. And then you can put SQL over it, because by definition it does not support SQL. But if you want SQL support, you can add a Hive layer to it. And then you've got these other tools. And you have things like HBase and Kafka and all these other tools out here. So we'll kind of take a look at that. Okay, yes, also support for that. So HDInsight cluster types. We can create that Hadoop one that we saw at the core. We can create HBase, which is a NoSQL, and I mean not SQL supporting, high volume, massive big data kind of storage for data. So it's good for that. Interactive query support. I mentioned things like Hive and stuff, so you can use that cluster type if you're interested in using SQL against data. Kafka, which is kind of like message queuing for big data. So I think of it kind of like as Microsoft used to use MSMQ. It's kind of like that. It's a queuing system, and it's, I think, really designed to sort of allow for asynchronous communication so you don't lose anything. So it's used a lot in streaming and things like that. ML services, which is not anything to do with Hadoop, and it's actually really not part of Hortonworks, so kind of an interesting thing. But it's something you can, in there, you can do is create a machine learning server. A few years back, Microsoft bought a company called Revolution Analytics, and they made something called R Server. And R Server basically was a single server scale-up architecture for R. So if you think of what SQL does, SQL Server, you submit a SQL request, and it will meet that request as fast as possible. It'll use all the core, all the memory, everything you've got, and give you a result. And it is able to scale within a machine. Machine learning services, or R services originally, did exactly the same thing. Microsoft bought it. Part of what it did was integrate that into SQL Server and call that the machine learning server. And they also offer it as a standalone, because it always was a standalone with R Server as well, so that if you just want to use that scale-up technology, you can do that. So if you create a machine learning server, services in here as a cluster type, you'll be able to scale up to that single machine, which is really sort of, to me, a mid-scale, because if you use open source R and Python on your own machine, if it fills memory, it doesn't chunk memory out, it doesn't page, it just crashes. It doesn't run very fast by definition unless you do some extra work to do parallel processing and multi-threading and all that stuff, whereas machine learning services does all that. So it's not, machine learning services isn't your sort of Spark level solution where you're looking at petabytes, but it's also much, much more scaled up than a single machine, your own client machine. Think of it sort of along the lines of what SQL Server would scale to. So hundreds of millions of rows typically wouldn't be a problem, and it can handle a lot of data. But when you get to that like petabyte and beyond, you want to start looking at something more like Spark. And Spark is the other type. You can create a Spark cluster. And it's an interesting question to be considered is if you want to use Spark on Azure, you've actually got a really great option in Azure Databricks. Azure Databricks will give you, not only at the hub of it, Spark, but it creates a whole set of tools designed for secure machine learning, large machine learning team collaboration with fine granularity in terms of security and assigning roles, and all kinds of things, and really very flexible cluster types, and being able to spin up and spin down many different clusters within it. So Databricks is a more sort of high-end sort of Cadillac or high-end car solution that gives you everything in a wrapper, etc. But if you're looking for more of that lower level, you want more of that detailed control, you don't maybe want to use the notebooks that come with Databricks, and you want to use your own thing, RStudio, which you can do with Databricks now, but you want to use PyCharm, or you want to use other things, or you really like Jupyter Notebooks, and you just want that lower level control, then Spark as a HDInsight cluster is a good option. Gives you that Spark speed and everything else, and those wonderful features of Spark, but a lower level control and less overhead and things to go with that, I suppose. So that's an option. And then Storm is really like more IoT kind of thing where you want to do real-time event processing kind of stuff. So those are the cluster types. I'm going to just focus on the simplest, the first one, Hadoop, just to kind of walk through how we can do this. And as I mentioned, machine learning services is really not part of Hadoop. So when you go in to create a cluster, you'll see this, and there's a link at the bottom there. You can get to this information about it, and you can see the types of things available there that you can create. So let me step back for a minute. I want to go into Azure for a minute. So I'm in the Azure portal. I go to portal.azure.com, log in, and I can see my resources. I tag them into my dashboard. What I want to do is just quickly show you a little bit before I get in so you understand what we're doing. When you automate with PowerShell, it very closely emulates what you would do in the portal. So whatever resources you're going to create, change, whatever, I recommend getting familiar with what happens in the portal, because it's an easy way to conceptualize what's going to happen in your scripts. you also kind of get an appreciation of, wow, if I automate this, I can save a lot of steps in some cases, because sometimes it's a lot of, it's like a wizard, but you get a lot of questions like, oh, okay, what do I want for VNet? What IP addresses do I want? So let me try. So I'm going to say create a resource. And one of the nice features I can do is just start typing what I want. So I'm looking for HDInsight. And I'll just search for that. And I get that right away. And by the way, I noticed when I did this earlier, there's a whole bunch of new monitoring services available for these clusters and things. So take a look at those. But I'm just going to go say, in documentation, don't forget, say create. And I'm going to save Microsoft money by not creating yet another thing in their environment. But I could call this Brian123K. It's going to make sure that that's a unique name so that I can reference it. I can tell it what subscription I want to use. Okay. And I got this. I can give it now an admin name. So I have to give it an admin and also an SSH username. Typically on like a VM, you give it an admin name. So I give it that, and then a login password, and then SSH user, which has to be a different type of username. Now it's really important, this part. Resource groups are basically just containers, are boxes. Think of it like a box, and you say, okay, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create an HDInsight cluster, or maybe even a SQL database as a service, or I want to create a VM. And what a resource group says is I want to kind of put it all together in this one box. The advantage of that, doing that, is some performance things in terms of how SLAs can be met and Microsoft can manage behind the scenes. But the real takeaway that I look at for it is, especially when you're learning, is I can throw the whole box away when I'm done. I don't have to worry about it. If I didn't keep track of it, or I merged lots of different things in one resource group, it's not so easy to throw that away when I'm done and get rid of all the costs and overhead, all those things that went with it. So I would recommend, especially if you're just playing around for the first time, but in general, create a resource group. I always say RG underscore so I can keep track of my resource groups, and then, you know, whatever I'm going to be creating. So that's the idea there. I can say I'm going to be creating this resource group, and then when I'm done, I can just throw it away and everything goes with it. Be careful with that though, because there'll be potentially blob storage and things. I may have files I've uploaded and things. If I throw away the resource group, it's all gone, everything. If I just want to not pay for the cluster, I can delete the cluster. I'm going to show you how to do that. And then I still have blob storage things and things related to that. So I'm going to quit out of this. And I'm going to go to here. So if I'm not already logged in, I have to log into the account. Now I have training and things like that of ways to automate even the login using what's called a service principal. And I can, I believe I have another video and I'm going to be doing more, but you can also do things right within Azure under what's called runbooks, which are under the automation account, which is just another resource. One of the really great things about Azure is it has a lot of great automation options. And my favorite is the automation account, because you can create PowerShell scripts in it called runbooks, and scripts can call scripts, and you can set up automation credentials. And what I really like too, it's all self-contained, so I don't have to log into Azure to do things. I can just set up job schedules to say, maybe every Friday night, look at resources which are no longer, which are dev resources that I don't expect anyone to be needing, and turn them off or remove them. So it's a good way to, again, manage costs and only pay for what I'm really going to be needing. So, but before I can do anything, I have to do this login. Now I've already done the login, and sometimes what I did to test this is I can use this PowerShell command, which is part of the Azure RMVM command. And it's just, I just said list my VMs that are out there, and I've got a lot. They're all turned off, but I do have some out there for different purposes. All right, so let me go to create. And I've got the script. I'm going to walk through the script a little bit, but it's a function. So one of the nice things about a function is, and I do a lot of stuff, I have a whole thing on modules, so go look at that. But you can create a library of functions. But I'm just going to run it. And when I run it, what it does is it creates this function in memory. And I can go here and prove that by just doing a directory on function. And this is called a provider. And you see all kinds of stuff in there. But I call this new UDF. And where are my UDFs? So you can see UDF HD cluster here. I click it. Oh, it didn't. Good. So you can see it right there. When I name functions, you follow the commandlet naming standards, which is a verb-noun. The verbs are controlled by the PowerShell police, so you've got to follow standards. And that's good because they have a sort of way of understanding. New means you're creating a new asset, some sort of new thing. So it's important to follow the right conventions, what you're naming. However, the noun part's pretty flexible. So I always start it with UDF, meaning user-defined function, and then the object name. And that allows me to know this is not a built-in PowerShell function, so I don't get myself confused. I can also, these tags are great. If I ask for help, I'll get help on the function with the tags I give it. So these are like Java doc type things. They give you extra documentation. And as always, remember commandlet binding. Commandlet binding is an awesome, very simple thing. That's all I need is that one little line in my function, and it inherits basically all the functionality of PowerShell. In particular, it supports what's called common parameters, which is great for debugging and for putting out messages during your scripts, etc. But you need to have that to get that support. So now we've got this. I'll go back and explain what's going on in there. But a lot of times, even in my modules and things, and when I write scripts, I like to have an example of making a call to it. And a good way to do this is also to put variables in that have what you need, and then you just change what you want. Like in my case, what do I want to call the cluster, and things like that. And then I can just pass those parameters in. And with so many parameters, it's not required, but it's a good idea to use the named parameter approach with PowerShell. So this function has these named parameters, and then I pass in the variables. In PowerShell, $sign denotes a variable name, and so I'm just passing these in as parameters. So I'm going to enter these parameters, and then what I did is, if you're wondering, it didn't run this because these are commented out. So I use this comment block so that I can run the function script and create the function, and then I can just do this. So now I'm going to run it. I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to use the page green arrow, and that just runs what I've selected, so I can assign those things. And you can see down here, and if I say $P underscore location, for instance, it comes back, so it tells me it's assigned. And then I don't want you to see what I'm entering for a password, so I'm going to do this little thing using the read host, and that should not show you what I type here. All right, and then say OK, and now I have that entered. And now for the moment of truth here, I'm going to run my function, which will create my cluster. And I like to do a lot of these. You can see a message. So it's running. So you notice the red box here tells me it's running. This takes a while, to be honest. It's so Azure Databricks, another plug for them. It's a lot faster in Databricks. If I go in with Databricks in about 5 minutes, I think it is, it will give me access to the service. And then within that, it doesn't give me any clusters until I ask for one. Clusters typically take about 5 minutes to create, maybe a little longer, depending on what's going on, I guess. But I find them to be pretty quick. All right, so let's walk through the function. So a function, if you don't know, again, look at my other tutorials and stuff, because I'm really big on extensibility. I don't like to write the same code more than once. I'm too lazy, and you should be too. So what you want to do is write a function and have that function take parameters that will change its behavior so that you can have it, like in this case, creating an HDI cluster, HDInsight Cluster, and I never have to do that again. I can just pass it in and make my changes to it. So let me look at the parameters. So the first parameter I have is a cluster name. That makes sense. That's the string I pass in. And then I've got this password. Now, as far as I know, PowerShell may be the only language that's optionally strongly typed. It's a really interesting feature. So as we know, Python, for instance, is sort of dynamically typed, which means you can't tell it what to define as a primitive type, like integers and strings, but it will figure it out and go that way. R is the same way. And then you've got languages like C or Java, which you do define more strong typing. And in PowerShell, you can choose which you want. So this parameter string is strongly typed. But as password is not. And the reason is I'm putting it through that algorithm and convert it into a secure string. So it's not a simple string, and I don't want to worry about it. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of letting PowerShell basically create anything it needs to pass in that secured string. I could use a sort of more low-level type definition and use the object definition for a secure string, but I'm a little lazy here, and it suits the purpose like this. So when you don't know what's coming in and you just want to pass an object in, that's a way to do that in PowerShell and any kind of things you're creating. But here I definitely want strings, and I have these equals means that if I don't give it a value, it will default to these values. They may not be valid in this case because I don't think those usernames are complex enough. And then what I'm doing is I don't want to have to tell it the resource group name and storage account names. So I use RG underscore, and I just prefix that on the cluster name. So RG underscore cluster name is going to be the name of my resource group. And for storage account name, I put SA. Now, pretty sure it doesn't like underscores in your storage account name, so I didn't do the underscore, but it's going to be like SA, HD, whatever name. Storage account is going to be where I'm going to be putting blob storage and things. So when I want to move data up and work around with it, I could move it into blob storage as a starting point. And I've got a container. name. So within an account, you create a container to hold your files and stuff. And then here I'm using my cluster name. It's going to be what I've assigned to it. Cluster nodes, how many. Now, if you didn't use the command-let binding here, then these write verbose statements would be completely ignored. It's like you never typed them. So you do need command-let binding because those are considered common parameters. And they'll only fire off displaying if I put the dash verbose parameter on the call to the function. But I like this kind of thing because by doing it, verbose is going to show me all the different parameters I entered, what it's calling things, what's the storage account it's going to use. So it gives me a lot of information. And you can see somewhere up here, it did that. It displayed all that information. And if I wanted to, I had this originally, I was logging in, but I don't have to. I already pre-logged in. So I'm going to create a new resource group using the resource group name and location that we passed in. I'm going to do some write output. This probably could also be done just easily with write verbose. By the way, you want to write output, not write console, because it's more contextually sensitive. It works better. Best practices seem to be try to avoid doing the write console directly. And here I'm doing my new Azure RM storage account and passing parameters. And here I'm going to then create a storage account key and destination. So one thing, if you notice, there's a lot of pieces to creating things in Azure, and even a cluster. It has that screen, you go through Blades, you fill out some things, but there's a lot of pieces that you have to fill out. So having a script that sort of defaults some things, uses prefixes for your resource group, can make your life easier. And since I know that when I create resource groups, I tend to go RG_, I can just look for things like that. It's really important with resource groups in particular to be able to find things. All right, so, and then here's the big thing at the end. I say create, right here, HDInsight Cluster. I give it the resource group, the cluster name, the cluster type, location, default storage account, blah, blah, blah. And there's all these different pieces that go into it. Now you can get this code on GitHub, so really not going to beat it to death here. Play around with it. Be careful. Make sure you delete what you don't want. This is, you know, it's a pay-as-you-go model, and if you don't get rid of it, you'll pay because you left it there. All right, there we are. So that's kind of what's going on here. Let's see what this is. Still creating the cluster. While waiting for that to run, I'm going to show you the two other scripts, and then hopefully this thing will finish and we can wrap things up. So I have two other scripts here. One is to delete the cluster, and the other script is to delete the entire resource group. So obviously I need to run this in the correct order, because if I delete the resource group, there'll be no cluster to delete. So when I'm ready, I can run the remove Azure HDInsight Cluster. Now it's something I'm not showing, and I will put it in here because it's sort of implicitly getting loaded. But if I do import module, I can say Azure RM, and I can actually explicitly import that. Since the script is running, I'm not going to be able to run that right now, but it's already implicitly done that. And so here I'm going to be able to say delete the cluster, and this is not necessary. Okay, here I can really assign it a value. So what I want to really be doing here, let me go back and make sure I get the right value. So I'm going to put that in here. Somehow I forgot to do that. Okay, and that looks good. Cluster name. So that should help me. I put this param block in here. Again, it's not necessary, but I wanted to demonstrate if you were to put this as a runbook within Azure, you'd want to use the param block, and that's how you could do this. Here I'm hard coding the variable here, and I can run it this way. And actually, I did have a reason for why I did this, but I'm not. So I'm actually going to take this out by commenting it out, because I want to show you another way to run this. And what I can do is I can show you how to run this so that you can run this scr_delete_HDInsight _cluster script. I can call that and pass parameters into it, just like it was basically making the script itself a function I can call. I could also put it within a module, but I can do it this way as well. Okay, so you can see that this finally finished, and did take a little bit, but I'd say I think it was about 20 minutes maybe or so. You can see it's giving all these attributes and things. So we have now created an HDInsight cluster. If we go here, we can see One shouldn't show. Let me try to run this. And we can see this is showing the X one. I don't know why. Right there, A. Okay. So this is our resource group, and we can see our cluster is here. It's got some storage accounts set up with it, which we created. I noticed that SA prefix on the storage account. And this is our attribute. So I'm not going to get into how to use HDInsight and stuff, but basically suffice to say, now we have a cluster. We could connect to it. We can do queries. We can do things. We can write MapReduce. This, I don't believe this would support SQL because I just asked for a Hadoop cluster to get the basics in. Now, one thing I will point out real quickly, if you're looking to automate and turn things on and off or track costs, using tags is a great way to do it, because I can go in here and say something like type and say the value is dev. Okay. And then just save that. And you can see now it has a type dev. It's a JSON type thing. I could in PowerShell look for that tag, and so anything flagged with a type of dev, I could basically turn off. If it was like a VM or do things, if it's a cluster, I can delete the cluster. I don't want to delete the storage account necessarily, or the resource group, because I mentioned then you lose all your data. But so one thing that Azure does is separates your data, which is from your storage of data, from the actual cluster, so you can get rid of the cluster and not have to pay for it. That's the compute side, but you can still keep your data. All right, so let me go back to our scripts. And so I've got the script, and I wanted to show you this parameter thing. And I can do import Azure RM. That just brings in that module. I don't need to per se here. And what I got here then is I'm going to run this. Now, what I want to do is I commented this out because I'm going to call it as a script and show you how you can actually do this. So what I'm going to do here is pass in the name of the cluster I want to delete right here. So I'm going to steal that code. And by the way, if you're wondering, like, what's the difference between double quotes or single quotes on a string? Double quotes allow for string expansion. So if I put escape sequences or anything special in there, or variable names, it will expand them and replace the variables. But if I use single quotes, it will not. It says that's literally what I'm taking. Even if I put dollar signs in there, it will not try to expand it to variables. CD. And now if I look here, I can see I have my scripts right here. And we ran one. So now what I want to do is I want to call a script that's in my current folder. To do that, I have to do period / and then I can do the name. And notice IntelliSense is telling me which one do I want. So I'm going to delete the HDInsight cluster. And now I'm just going to paste the parameter. Oops, I copied it again. Forgot the other thing. So let me go back and recopy this. And I can notice it gives me the cluster name. I can do this. So what I'm doing, which is kind of cool, is this is called dot sourcing. And I have a whole place. Now this place, I know the video I did that I talk about this. But what it does is it lets me use a script to store a function, and I can call that script and pass parameters into it directly. So I can treat the script itself as a function. So it's really cool. It's a great way to sort of develop and test your functions. I highly recommend watching my video on modules and how to create modules and things. That's a better way to sort of extend the functionality of PowerShell. But this is better than just modifying scripts. This allows you to use scripts as functions. So I'm going to call the script that's on the screen in front of you, but this is going to call it through the command line, and it should go out and delete the cluster that I created. Again, the idea behind deleting clusters is you're not going to lose the data, but you're not going to have to keep paying for compute. So if you're using you know, a Hadoop cluster or a Hive querying cluster, and weekend's coming, or you're going to go away for a week and nobody else is going to be using it, good idea to delete it. You can recreate it when you come back. And the reason I like scripts and why I want to suggest using PowerShell is because you can set it up so you can just run a script and boom, go get a cup of coffee, you come back, your cluster's ready to go. As we saw, it may take a little bit, a couple of cups of coffee, but you'll get it. So that's what's going on here, and this is going to take a couple of minutes, I think, to get rid of the cluster as well. One thing I also noticed is typically when you are in the portal, this little bell here, when you're doing things manually, it will give you messages of what's happening. But when you're running scripts, it does not, so you don't get to see what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so we have now deleted our cluster, and if we go back here, we can have to refresh, because if I don't refresh this, it'll probably not show the true situation. Now the cluster is deleted, the resource group is not. Let's see, resource group. Oh, wait a minute. Let me do it this way, RG HDI. And we can see, we do see our resource group here. But if we go in it, we shouldn't see. So now we see the storage account, but we don't see the HDInsight Cluster anymore. So we accomplished our goal. Back here. And so, a couple of takeaways. So kind of summarizing what we covered. We were able to do the dot. Key thing here, dot / means that the script we want to run is in the current folder. And we're not dot sourcing. I should correct that because I think I called it dot sourcing. Dot sourcing is when we say, if we were dot sourcing, the only difference would be we would be putting a period space before this. The period space before that says whatever I create in this script, like variables or functions, keep it available, keep it in memory. If I don't do that, if I do it this way, it's a false true script. So I'm calling the script, I'm passing the parameter. It will use the function because it will be there while it's running the script. But when the script ends, it deletes the function that got created. So that's the one takeaway. And I didn't give it a function name, so it really doesn't have any name anyway. So it's just calling the script and falling through. So which you do is completely up to what you're trying to do. If you're calling a script and you want to define functions in the script and keep them around, then you do the dot sourcing approach. So let me switch over now to the sort of end game of all this. Here I've got this A, so I'm going to change this now. It was X before. My playing around, I'm going to make it A. And I'm going to run this. You could do dot sourcing, and that's where the parameter comes in handy. But I believe that'll just get ignored, and I'm just going to define my variable resource group. And so what I'm doing here is saying just blow it all away. So this is when you say, I'm done with all this. I was playing around, maybe preparing to do something, show management what I'm doing something, and you want to delete it all. So this is, try to put a disclaimer. I'll put it here so you can't miss it. This will delete everything and cannot be undone. I'm not really sure that's true. I don't know if there's a way to undo it, but to play it safe, I will say I said that, but that's what's going on there. So just be careful. So what I'm going to do is I'll save this and I'm going to run it, and it should get rid of our entire resource group this time. So I'm going to, this will only run what I select. This will run the entire script. So let's run it. And it's now submitting that entire script to run. Okay, so what we've done in the demonstration is we created an HDInsight cluster, which was a Hadoop cluster. We deleted the cluster. We didn't delete the resource group yet, and then we went through and deleted the resource group. So those are the three main components. And again, deleting the entire resource group is only when you're really done with everything. Deleting the cluster is a good way to manage your costs. So again, to keep the data but not pay for clusters, remove the cluster. So that's really a good idea to control costs. But to get rid of everything, again, just delete the entire resource group. And there's a link here that you can go to which talks about that, deleting a cluster. You can do it interactively or with PowerShell or with the Azure CLI or a number of ways. So in closing, we've seen that HDInsight is Hadoop on Azure as a platform as a service. And what that means is it's just really a lot of ease. You don't have to worry about the hardware underneath the covers. You don't have to worry about administering patches and a lot of things like that. It makes it a lot easier to configure it. You just say how many nodes do you want, and the cluster nodes get created and allocated automatically. So it's just a lot easier to work with the platform as a service. And so we saw that, and we saw several different types of clusters. We looked at the sort of, as I call it, the kitchen drawer, many different things in the Hadoop ecosystem. But we noticed this is the Hortonworks distribution of Hadoop, and we looked at the different types of clusters we can have. So we can do Hadoop itself. If we want SQL support, we can do more of a Hive cluster. We can do Spark, we can do Storm, we can do Kafka, and we even have one that really has nothing to do with Hadoop, which is Machine Learning Services Server. So I hope you've liked this. Please like, subscribe, and share, because to be honest, I really get excited when I know a lot of people are getting value out of this. I get some great comments and I appreciate it. But the more people kind of like So I'm putting the content out there, but what I really need is people to share it with other people so that more people can benefit from it and save them the pain and aggravation of learning the hard way, which is typically what I do. So I like to save other people that sort of thing. So yeah, subscribe, share, like, and thank you for watching.